Hey, this morning we are talking about knowing yourself that you can know God, and we're going to get into kind of our emotions and feelings. And I don't think it would be fair if I didn't share that I am feeling excited right now. And let me tell you why. Because of the testimony that Mark just had with Anthony, and that Laura is also here, and both of those people came to the bridge through Alpha, and that, my friends, gets me excited. So thank you. And I am grateful for Mark and Rachel and their commitment to people on the outskirts of church, and that they brought Alpha. So grateful for that. Hey guys, we are in week 2 of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. We are going through this book by Pete Scazzero, I think is how you best pronounce it. And we've been working through this in small groups, and my hope is that you're in a small group processing this journey with people who care about you. Because the reality is this: the healthy life that you want and the holy life that God desires for you begins with doing the hard work of self-discovery and self-knowledge. It's a journey inward to understand who we are, and it's really important work in our discipleship with Jesus. So buckle up, we're taking the journey inward today. All right, it's interesting that in business and in church leadership today, one of the major trends is self-awareness. Right? Seminars, books, videos, workshops, all dedicated to helping you get to know yourself and who you are. And I think for a good reason, too, because we know this, that generally people who are not self-aware or people who are unaware of themselves can be dangerous in leadership positions. I'd imagine if you took a moment right now, you probably could think of some people that you followed or leaders in your life that, man, you just thought that is not a very self-aware person. And it's difficult to follow those kinds of leaders. People who are unaware generally erode healthy relationships. They have difficult times in their marriages and in friendships. My favorite self-unaware person today in pop culture is Michael Scott. Maybe watch The Office, right? Here's a couple of memes from Michael Scott. I just think this one is really funny. Business is a doggy-dog world, and I'm a shark who eats doggy dogs. But this one, I think, hits to the point of Michael Scott's unawareness. Do I need to be liked? Absolutely not. I like to be liked. I enjoy being liked. I have to be liked. But it's not like this compulsive need to be liked, like my need to be praised, right? Like the guy's totally just not aware of himself. And I think the reason that people love The Office, and the reason that Michael Scott is so lovable is because we can see our own self-unawareness. We can resonate and identify with Michael Scott. And maybe if not you, you know somebody who can, and you're probably looking at him right now. We know people who are self-unaware. Man, I looked at a study recently. People were polled. 95% of people believe that they are self-aware. They have great self-knowledge of themselves. They were confident in this. But when they took a test, which included their own kind of responses, plus people who knew them well, only 15% were actually self-aware or had self-knowledge, which means that 80% of people are living their lives thinking, I'm totally self-aware, I'm totally in tune with who I am as a person. And it's just not true. I think if we take that high percentage of people who are not self-aware, and you add that to the reality that in order to know God and really know others well, that you have to be self-aware. If you take the fact that there are a lot of people who are not, and that we have to be self-aware in order to know God, it might explain why so many people feel stuck in their relationship with God. It might explain why people feel stuck in their relationship to others and with themselves. And that, my friends, is what we're going to unpack today, getting to know ourselves so that we can get to know God. If you created a search on the parameters of knowing yourself, you would find all across the pages of the Bible and in early church history and in modern psychology kind of this idea or an emphasis on being keenly in tune with oneself as the primary vehicle for a healthy relationship with God and others. Like that's where we're going kind of today, and that we understand that we have to be keenly aware of ourselves so that we can be in healthy relationship with God and others. Augustine said this in 480. Augustine was an early church father and the bishop of the church. He said, "How can you draw close to God when you are far from your own self? He would pray, grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I would know you. Teresa of Avila said this, almost all the problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge. And then finally, Jesus says this, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that you would love your neighbor as yourself. You see, I think we've got to understand that the journey toward knowing God and knowing ourselves begins by being aware of the emotions and the feelings going on inside us, and knowing the experiences that kind of undergird those emotions and feelings. Right? It's one thing just to be fully aware of what you're feeling and the emotions you're having in certain circumstances, but it's also important to understand what has happened that's causing me to feel the way that I feel. See, feelings are these indicators of what's happening inside us based on what's going on outside of us. Right? You get feelings. Your whole body is kind of like a giant brain. It responds to situations. You've probably had this experience before. You see somebody in the grocery store that you don't want to see, and you go the other way. You go down on like the vegan aisle, and you're a meat eater, but like you like your body tenses up, right? Maybe there's some moment of conflict you have to engage, and your body has a physiological response to this situation because our feelings are indicators, something going on inside of us based on what's happening on outside of us. And the task of self-knowledge, the task of self-discovery, becoming self-aware, okay, that whole idea is asking the question, what is causing me to feel this way? Right? A lot of times we don't do that. We ignore it, we move on, we justify it. But if we really want to get to know who we are so that we can get to know God and we can get to know others, we have to ask this question, why? What is causing me to feel this way? And ultimately, what am I going to do about it? Like, it takes time to reflect and pause and figure that out. Pete, he's my friend. I call him Pete. Pete says, dividing our knowledge of God and knowledge of self can keep us at a fixed level of emotional and spiritual development. Let me say that again. Dividing our knowledge of God and our knowledge of self can keep us at a fixed level of emotional and spiritual development. In Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, he shares this story, or he shares this observation about his own life. He says, my discipleship and spirituality had addressed neither my insecurities nor my understanding of myself. That's so fascinating to me. My discipleship had addressed neither my insecurities nor the understanding of myself. Breaking free would require learning to feel, learning to distinguish feeling and thinking, and finally summoning the courage to follow my God-given true self rather than the voices and demands around me. Like, I wonder how many of us are given in to following the voices and the demands around us because we don't have a great understanding of who we really are. I totally resonate with him on this situation of understanding myself and having insecurities. A few years ago, I had a moment where I became painfully aware that I lacked self-knowledge. And it took some time with my counselor to help me process a very painful and embarrassing moment in my marriage that I will share with you today. A couple of years ago, whenever it was 5, so he's 8 now, so about 3 years ago, Everett he got molluscum somehow. If you know what a molluscum is, it's like they're like small little bumps. It's a viral skin infection, and they get kind of itchy, but they just start showing up all over your body. And the problem with molluscum is it itches, and then as you scratch it, it spreads. Right? He's 5. Like, don't itch, don't. Okay, right? They were multiplying at a rapid rate. He had hundreds of these little bumps all over his body. And I ended up getting a couple of them on my arm, and I had gone to see a dermatologist, not about that, but he was checking him. I said, oh yeah, it's molluscum, no problem here, hold on. He goes, this is a guy, he's so aggressive, like I had a couple of moles. I'm like, yeah, whatever. He's like, let me see that. And he pulls it, yep. Get a razor blade. Like, before I knew it, it was gone. Like, okay, buddy. Like, the guy's very aggressive. Anyway, he just, like, reaches over, grabs his tool, come here, pop, 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 pop. Like, just, it hurt, but, like, he popped all these molluscum bumps, cleaned them. He's like, yeah, you'll be fine. They'll go away. I'm like, okay, that was easy. So Vanessa and I have this conversation. The bumps are getting worse on Everett, and we're like, well, the fastest and the most effective way to get rid of it, we got to pop them. We got to get rid of them. We tried creams, we bought creams, and tried different online homeopathic type stuff, and nothing was working. And so we agreed that we would try to pop 5 a day until we could get rid of them, right? So it was at night. So one evening, We'd done it a couple times already. Everett kind of knew it was coming. We're bribing him with like ice cream, prize, like whatever. Just sit there and endure the pain. We're popping these bumps. And on this particular, like Everett's, like he has that ouch cry. If you're a parent or if you've been around kids, you know that ouch cry. It's like, okay, he can handle a little bit more. Well, that ouch cry, that ouch cry turned into panic pain cry. That's like the cry that like, you like switch gears. Now, Vanessa wasn't engaged necessarily, like her mindset and our agreement was she had to fight through the temptation to stop because we knew that this had to be done for Everett. But something clicked in me and I couldn't take it anymore. And I lost it. Like I turned green, like I lost it and I just like started yelling. I'm like, get away from him. What are you doing? You torturer. I don't know, like, I think I might have pushed her out. I might have grabbed it. I don't know what happened. I think I blacked out. Like, but I am like losing it, and she's yelling at me, and I'm yelling back, and like all of a sudden, like I don't know what happened. Like I snapped out of it, and I was like, oh, what happened? But it was too late. It was already too late. I had already hurt Vanessa pretty bad, just in my emotional over response. But I overreacted big time, and so. What I later discovered in counseling and talking with my counselor was that my feelings that I was having in that moment were of fear, of anger, and some insecurities that ultimately came from a place in my childhood where I felt unsafe and uncared for and was being hurt. And in that moment of seeing my son it didn't matter that it was mom, didn't matter that we had agreed on this, like I was all in for what was going on. Something happened where all of my emotions and my feelings, they came up. I didn't know how to respond to them, and they just came out, and it caused hurt. What I saw was happening to Everett, I interpreted it that somebody wasn't protecting him and somebody was hurting him, even though that wasn't true. My experience was one thing, but it wasn't necessarily true. And so what my counselor helped me understand is that the overreactions and underreactions aren't actually relevant to the situation, but they speak to something going on inside of us. Overreactions and underreactions aren't relevant to the situation. They speak to something going on inside us. There are appropriate reactions. If Everett's crying at this moment was like should have demanded like a level 3 response. Like, hey, maybe we should stop. Let's give it up for the night. You know, we'll be okay. You know, I could have responded to it, but I went like I was like 11. Like I turned it to 11. Like I took it too far. And what I realized is it spoke about something going on in me. And so that meant that I had to learn how to be aware of my emotions, my past experience. I had to engage my feelings so that I could heal, forgive, and grow. But I didn't acknowledge my emotions in that moment. Pete Scazzaro says, the journey of genuine transformation to emotionally healthy spirituality begins with a commitment to allow yourself to feel, to acknowledge, to know what's going on inside of you. And the reality is, friends, there's no shortcut here. To be fully formed, healthy people, we got to engage with our feelings and emotions before we react to them. Because there's a big difference between reacting and responding. And we also can't ignore our feelings and what's going on in our life. Last week we looked at Saul, and if you're in small groups, we kind of dug in going through the workbook. We looked at the life of King Saul. He was the first king of Israel, 1 Samuel 17. And I think we realized this. He, as a man, he was more likely than not, he did not engage in the work of knowing himself, his feelings, and his emotions. He had a lot of insecurities in himself. I think he realized at some point that he was chosen by Israel, and I think he realized that maybe God put him in power just because of what he looked like, because he was tall, because he was big, that he was put in this position of power. It certainly wasn't about who he was as a man as much as what people thought they wanted by looking at him and demanding something from him because of his stature. So when the prophet Samuel, if you follow this, if you read in 1 Samuel, kind of the whole book, you're going to find some really interesting things about Saul's life. But when Samuel talks with Saul about being king, he says, this is Saul's response. Samuel says, God has chosen you to be the king of Israel. This is Saul's response. But I'm only a Benjaminite from the smallest of Israel's tribes and the most insignificant clan in the tribe at that. Why are you talking to me about this? Like somewhere deep down, I don't even think he knew who he was as a person. But this idea, in many ways, depicts Saul's life from that point unto his death, and it's a shining example of emotionally healthy, his lack of emotional and spiritual health, right? Is his own insecurity, his own ability to recognize what was going on in his life. Now you contrast that with David, who also understood himself to be the smallest in his family. When he gets chosen by Samuel, even his dad says, you want to talk to the runt? Like the little guy? Like, look at all these other big strapping young... And Samuel's like, no, I need to talk to him. So I think David had an understanding that he wasn't the biggest. He came from the smallest in his family. But he loves God. He plays the harp. Which is awesome. He works hard at tending his father's sheep and at some point protecting him from a lion and bear. And I thought this was interesting as I was reading in Saul's life. There's a moment where Saul's dad says, hey, I lost my donkeys. Can you go find them? He's like, sure. Spends like 3 or 4 days trying to find the donkeys. He's like, I can't find them. Like, who cares? They're just donkeys. He like whines to a servant, let's just go home. My dad probably cares more about me than the donkeys anyway. Like, David loses some sheep, and he's like, I'm going to kill a bear, and I'm going to kill a lion to get the sheep back. There's a huge difference. But is David perfect? No, not at all. But does he engage his emotions and his feelings? Absolutely. Does he display emotional health? Yeah, totally. Here's 2 good examples from David's life that I think suggest this. First, when the Philistines are marching on the Israelite army, we know this story of David versus Goliath. Goliath is threatening the people of Israel. David hears about it, and I think he's appropriately outraged. He's talking to these older men, and even his brothers. He's like, what are you doing? Why are you afraid of this guy? We're Israel. We have God on our side. Why aren't you fighting? What's wrong, right? And he gets yelled at, like his brother makes fun of him, and then Saul says, you really want to go fight this guy? Here's David's response to the king of Israel. He says, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, I struck it, and I killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Like, here's a dude that I think he had a pretty good awareness. He had confidence in himself. He killed a lion and a bear. That's pretty cool. But I think he was confident in understanding who he was, and he certainly knew who God was, and he trusted in God's promise. And he said, listen, I can go after this. And he didn't say, like, I'm the best fighter in the world. Look at all the cool stuff I have. He just said, I trust in God, and I know what God is calling me to do. This is one example that I think David had a healthy understanding of himself. Number 2, David plays the harp. I dare you to show me a man that plays the harp that's not in touch with his emotions. Show me. Show me. Doesn't happen. Right? Doesn't happen. Right? Now listen, I understand that for most of us today, we are not going to just engage emotions and feelings. It doesn't feel right to just like, okay, I'm going to take 5 minutes. I want to sit down. Like, I'm going to reflect on what I'm feeling right now. And yet, contemplative spirituality suggests this is one of the most important things that we can do. Like, if we want to be fully formed people, we have to spend time engaging our inner self, our inner life and emotions. It's the beginning of our discipleship. Pete points out that the Bible paints a picture of both God and Jesus feeling. Here's a couple of things that you'll find as you read the Bible that both God and Jesus would have felt: joy, delight, regret, jealousy, anger, grief, love, compassion. And looking at Jesus' life just before the cross, we know that he felt troubled, and he expressed that he was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. How many of you can say that you've taken time in your life at moments of grief, sorrow, joy, regret, any of these things, and you said, you know what, I just need to sit in this a moment so that I can fully feel what's going on, so that I can respond appropriately. Like, I need to sit a moment with what I'm feeling so that I can respond faithfully in the way that God wants me to. Or maybe this is more true, is that all of a sudden you feel something, your body reacts in a physical way, and then you react to it in that moment. And then later on, you're like, I could have done that better. We've got to be people who engage inward. At the very least, the call of discipleship includes our experiencing our feelings, reflecting on our feelings, and thoughtfully responding to our feelings under the lordship of Jesus. It's not about letting our feelings control us. It's not about being out of control because of the way we feel. How do we submit our feelings and emotions to the lordship of Jesus so that we can be fully engaged, integrated people? The good news is that we have Jesus as a model of somebody that's fully self-aware, fully integrated, and having a really great understanding of himself. He knew who he was and who he wasn't, right? While there were many examples in the Gospels of Jesus living his true self in the face of criticism and opposition, right? There were moments he goes back to his hometown. He's teaching in the synagogue. He says a couple of things, and the people get pretty irritated with him. There are moments where people ask Jesus to do something, and he says, no, I want you to do something else or go a different way. Jesus was fully confident in himself. But one of the most well-known times in Jesus' life where we would believe that he's fully self-aware and confident in himself and confident in the Lord is the episode in Jesus' life where he was tempted by Satan after 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. I'm not going to dive into the entire story, but I want to point out a couple of things. First is this, that Jesus had a foundation of a healthy, intimate, meaning close, personal, and real. So Jesus had a healthy, an intimate relationship with God the Father. We not only do we see that in his life, right, but even if you look in Luke, it says that when Jesus was in the temple and his parents had left after the Passover, it says that Jesus was in the temple. He's talking with temple leaders. He says to his parents, don't you know I should be about my Father's business? But what's really interesting is the last part of that little section, it says that Jesus continued to grow in wisdom and in favor with God and with men. And that's really fascinating to me because he continued to grow in his relationship with God. And then you come to this point of his baptism, where I think he already had a fully formed relationship with his Father, a foundation of love. Oh, I lost my place here. There we are. He had a fully formed relationship with his Father, a foundation on love, and we see God's affirmation of his love for him when God says at Jesus' baptism, this is my Son in whom I am well pleased. And it was just a couple years ago that somebody pointed out to me and said, what did Jesus do up until that point to earn God's favor? He hadn't performed any miracles. He didn't raise anybody from the dead. He didn't multiply food. He didn't turn water into wine. As far as we know, there wasn't a whole lot that Jesus had done to point to God, to give honor to God, other than he had lived his life. But as far as the big stuff we read in the gospel, we don't see a whole lot. He says, this is my Son, and I'm in whom I'm well pleased. And I'm asking, pleased for what? Do you know how hard it is to get a parent to say they're pleased with you? It doesn't happen unless you got a jar full of marbles and a star full of charts, or a chart full of stars, right? In our home, we got a star chart, right? And I know I need to do a better job as a father telling Everett, I love you, and I'm pleased, and you're good enough. But man, growing up, we know this is true. It's not like your parents just went around and said, this is my son Craig, in whom I am well pleased. It just doesn't happen. God says that, and I think it's really important for us to understand that Jesus' love in his relationship with the Father is the foundation of his self-understanding and the root source of how he feels about himself. That, guys, this is where we're going right now, is talking about the root source of how we feel about ourselves. This affects the way we view ourselves and how we interpret and understand our emotions. Brene Brown says that success in our lives and working relationships begins with the core belief that you are enough. Jesus got that. I think that Jesus knew at that moment in his baptism, before he did anything, I think he knew, well, I'm loved and I'm enough. And I think it's out of that he lives the rest of his life and changes the world. And I think it's out of that he builds relationships with the disciples. And he tries to model for them that you're loved and you're enough. Because I'm going to be honest with you, if you read closely the gospel accounts of Jesus with the disciples, he calls them dumb a couple of times. Are you he says it are you you don't get it? Really? Seriously? And yet, I believe they knew that they were loved and that they were enough. in God's eyes. So that's the foundation. And then you look at the temptations. When the test really comes, Pete, in his book, breaks it down into 3 temptations that Jesus faces, that we face as well. The first, he says, is I am what I do. That life is about our performance. Right? The first temptation, if you remember, is Satan says to Jesus, hey, listen, 40 days, no food, like you got to be hungry. There's no Uber Eats, there were no Postmates. He's like, if you're really God, like if it's really your Father, then just turn these stones into bread. Come on. I am what I do. How many of you feel that way? That like you have to keep living, you have to keep working, you have to keep striving, so that in order to feel good about yourself, in order to receive love from others, you have to perform for them. Who's in that boat this morning? The second temptation is this: I am what I have. Possessions. Satan takes Jesus to this place where he can see the kingdoms of the world, and he says, I'll give you all of this. It's all yours. Just bow down to me. Jesus says, no. But how many of us have to maintain stuff? You got to have the latest thing, or a large home, or you got to be the person with the things so that people will like you, so that people will call you, so that people will want to hang out with you. How many of us receive love based on what we have? That we've made life about accumulating possessions. And yet you know that there's a lot of emptiness in just trying to have possessions. The last temptation was this: I am what others think of me. It's about popularity. He tells Jesus, hey, listen, if you're really God's son, like if you really have, then throw yourself off the temple. The angels will pick you up. Like if you're really something special, they'll take care of you. And Jesus says no to that. But how many of us build our external lives believing that that's how we're going to get loved? It's what I look like. It's the job that I have, the car that I drive. Like how many of us spend so much time just building, like we want to be known, so you're the person who knows everybody. You know, lots of people, only a little bit because you want to be known, or you want to be known as a person who's known. Temptations that we face. And Pete follows up with this. He says, these same 3 powerful temptations threaten us. And he rephrases them this way. And maybe you felt this. And you guys, this is where knowledge of self and knowing who God is come together. Like in these 3 things, I think this is where we pull together this understanding that we've got to know our feelings and our emotions. We have to be able to reflect and respond. We got to know where that stuff's coming from. Like we need to have self-awareness about what we're feeling, what's causing us to feel that way, and we also have to know these simple truths about God. Because these temptations threaten us today, that God's love for you will never be enough. You don't do enough. You're not smart enough. You really screwed that one up. You could have worked harder. You shouldn't have said that. Like these temptations that you are not good enough. God might love you if you were, it's simply not true. You're not lovable. Like you can't be lovable. People will love you for what you have, but for you as a person, nope. That's a temptation that we fall into. You're not lovable. And then finally, you're not good enough. That popularity thought, that temptation we fall into. Man, I struggle with this one big time. And Pete talks about it in his book, but I'm 37. And there are things in my life that I thought I would have accomplished by now. And I'm, by the grace of God, I'm like so thankful for my life. I'm thankful for this community. But I have friends who've like my age or a little bit younger, and they've published their books, and they get called for big speaking engagements. And I've sat before, and I've been flipping through my Instagram as I'm watching the success of my friends and people I went to college with, and I feel this. You're not good enough. And thankfully, engaging in emotionally healthy spirituality, I don't let it just become this dark moment in my life. I don't tune up my resume. I don't start looking for other things anymore. But I just sit and I say, okay, God, why am I feeling this? What's going on? And then I spend a little bit of time in gratitude, and I say, well, I know this is true, that I've committed my life to God and his will, and where he has brought me is where I ought to be. And I'm thankful for what God has done in my life. But this, you are not good enough. That's easy for us to fall into. Pete says, true freedom comes when we no longer need to be somebody special in other people's eyes because we know we are lovable and good enough. Man, I hope you hear and I hope you experience this every time we're together. I hope that as the people of the Bridge Church, I hope that you get this. You are lovable and you are good enough. Larry, you are lovable. Mike, you are good enough. Dave, you are lovable. Carrie, you are good enough. David, you are lovable. You are good enough. You got to hear that. That's the truth about God. You are lovable. You are good enough. I'm convinced that God's desire for each of us is to be fully in tune with our true and authentic self at every stage of our life. Like, this is what we're trying to get to by being emotionally healthy and in tune with what's going on inside, is that we would learn to live our true and authentic self. It's the best way we can show up in any relationship, is our true and authentic self. I was talking with a spiritual director recently, and she was talking about milestones. How many of you have a ruler on a wall in a home, like a giant 6-foot ruler, or somewhere in your house there's pencil on the wall for your kids? Or maybe you have thousands and thousands of photographs, and you look back and you remember. Videos are great. Facebook memories. Does anybody, if you're on Facebook and you see the fit, we just saw one the other day of Everett, like, grabbing mac and cheese and then, like, drenching it in ranch and, like, eating it. We were like, that was like an episode in our life. He doesn't do it anymore. I don't know if I'd care if he did, but it was just funny at 3. Like, he wouldn't eat anything unless it was soaked in ranch. So milestone, I suppose. But here's my point. As parents, we track milestones enthusiastically. Like, in my home, we have a big 6-foot ruler on the wall. On every birthday, we've marked our kids' height and the date. And I love looking at that. Loved celebrating, get excited about kids' first steps. The day they didn't have to wear diapers anymore was awesome. But with kids, we're always excited about first anything. But as we grow and we celebrate all kinds of exciting development achievements until we hit this invisible point in our life called old. And then we stop thinking about development and we stop thinking about milestones. And yet, we continue to grow and we continue to hit milestones. We stop talking about what's new and developing in our life, but instead we talk about what's old and deteriorating. Oh, man, I remember when I'd wake up and my knees didn't hurt, which is true for me right now. You know? Oh, man, I remember when I could stay up till the next morning. I'd go to sleep and wake up in the same day. I can't do that anymore. I'm too old. But we get there. We stop celebrating, then we start looking and we're like, okay, what do I need to do to get back to a different time in my life? What can I change? What can I modify? How do I adapt to this? But the truth is, we're always growing. We're always moving forward to the final moment where we're with God, fully restored. And yet, at every step in our life, there's still milestones. There's still developmental points, right? And God is still moving us to our true and authentic self. It doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter what stage of life you're in. You haven't missed it. We can still grow into our true and authentic self and hit that the milestone of I have become self-aware. We can hit a milestone of, like, I'm in tune with my feelings and my emotions. I understand what makes me feel this way, and I can reflect and respond appropriately. If we choose to, we can continue the journey of our knowing ourselves, and we can continue to know God better. Pete suggests 4 things in developing your authentic self. He says, first, pay attention to your interior silence and solitude. We are a hurried people, and we live frenetic lives, many of us, constantly on the move. This week, I was able to do the day by day. If you're in life groups, you've got the day by day. I just sat in my car. I'm usually driving from one school to another or one meeting to another. It's just kind of how my schedule works. And I just decided I'm just going to sit in the parking lot. And for about 15 minutes, I just read in the day by day, and I just sat and reflected. And it was enriching. Like, it was so good to stop and say, why do I feel so hurried right now? Like, I felt jittered because I had like 4 cups of coffee that morning. But why do I feel so hurried? You got to pay attention to your interior silence and solitude. Give yourself permission to turn the TV off, turn your phone off, and just reflect. You got to find trusted companions. Who are the people that are reminding you you are lovable and you are good enough? You're not acting in your true and authentic self right now. You need trusted companions. You got to move out of your comfort zone. It can be difficult to just pause. If you've been somebody that's worked 60 hours your entire life, or you constantly have to be on the move, or you need noise all the time, it's going to be hard to say, I need silence. But it's one of the best things you can do for yourself to move out of your comfort zone. And then finally, pray for courage. Ask the Lord for help in growing in your emotional and spiritual health. Ask the Lord, because his desire for you is to live a holy and healthy life, fully integrated, so that you can know him, and you can know others, and you can know yourself. I'm going to invite our worship team back up, and I've got a couple of questions for you to reflect on. So let's set the mood. I'm going to bring the lights down. Let's light some candles. Oh, okay, they're just lights down then. Okay. Here's a couple of questions, and what I'd like to do is, for maybe the first half of the song, I'd like to leave this slide up. I'd love for you guys just to take a look and think about some of these questions for your life. What step in developing your authentic self do you need to take today? Do you need to just be quiet? Do you need silence and solitude? Do you need to figure out, are you living under the pressure of what other people are telling you should be? Which temptation or lie are you buying into? What feelings have you been suppressing that are starting to leak on other people around you? Like, what's been going on the last couple of months? What's happening that people are not experiencing your full self? What they're experiencing is the overflow of anger, sadness, insecurity. What are you pushing down? What are you ignoring that you see is starting to come out and you have a hard time feeling joy right now? What are you missing out on because you don't know yourself very well? Missing out on relationships with your kids or grandkids? You're missing out on relationships with friends? Missing out on opportunities because you don't know yourself very well? What are others in your life missing out on because you don't know yourself well? What's happening with your spouse? What is your spouse missing out on? What are your friends missing out on? What are your kids missing out on? Because you don't have great self-knowledge right now. Because you got to grow. Take some time to reflect on this as we worship.